Welcome to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, check out seanmurphy.net. Hey guys, welcome back to Some Things Considered. This is the podcast where we are obsessed with creativity, we celebrate storytelling, and we endeavor to connect with interesting and successful people to figure out what makes them tick and get behind the scenes. I'm Sean Murphy, your host. I'm an author. I run the Center for Story at Shenandoah University and founded the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about that, check out seanmurphy.net. But the connecting tissue of the things that I do and am interested in are about interrogating story and storytelling, and not just for its own sake, but hopefully taking a deeper dive into why story, in my opinion, is everything. And we can really break down so many aspects of what motivates us and what we do through the lens of narrative. So that affords me the opportunity to kind of get outside of my own kind of artistic comfort zone and expand the boundaries of what story is. So today, not only is no exception, we're really raising the bar on a lot of levels, and it's a tremendous pleasure and honor to introduce and welcome Grant Shonkwiler. Let me give you his bio, and then you can hear from the horse's mouth what this guy is and why I was so keen to have him in this conversation. Grant started making games when he was 12 years old and has since filled many roles in the game industry as a programmer, lead designer, technical producer, and currently serving as a leadership coach and production consultant. His career has taken him from casual games at Megatouch to AAA shooters at id Software to Epic Games working on Fortnite, which you may have heard of. He currently runs his own consulting company and is co-author of 4 books, including Gear Up, Advanced Game Development Practices. Grant also enjoys building communities within the industry and is still conceptualizing new ideas, which we'll get into. Grant, thank you so much for being here. It's an absolute thrill to have some time with you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to talk about story and games, but also just story in life and leadership and all those things, because I agree with you firmly that story is everything. It's how we get people on board. It's how we bring people alongside of us and how we move forward as a world.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things I'm trying to do, in my own very modest way with this podcast is as much as possible. I mean, of course, anyone that pays attention to this knows that we have a soft spot for creatives that focus on writing and the creative arts, but I'm not doing my job in the roles I serve if I'm not constantly trying to, it's not just enlarging and fitting story into other things. It's really more taking a step back and appreciating, even for creatives, to have an opportunity to understand. I never really thought that deeply about how creativity infuses so many different endeavors, and story is being used at different levels in mastery across all different types of genres. So I think it would be helpful to set the tone. Your bio is suitably impressive, but I don't even think covers like I'm in the presence of greatness. So walk us through kind of your career and how you've gone from enthusiast to expert and beyond.
Yeah, well, that intro humbles me in this flattery. So, I think what's interesting, I was thinking a bit about how to do my bio slightly different than I do for game podcasts and stuff like that, where people might know my work a little bit better. And as I was thinking about how I got into this, it really started with story. And I had never really thought of it that way before. And now I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. So I started making games when I was 12 years old. And the reason I did that is because a friend and I, we were like sharing a game cartridge back and forth, and we ended up getting in an argument over what we had done. Basically, I ruined our game because we were sharing a save. And we got in like an actual fist fight, right? We were fighting, and then we sat back, as we were exhausted, taking deep breaths. And I just looked at him and I said, why don't we just make a better game? And really crazy to think two 12-year-olds thought they could make a better game than Pokemon. But we did, and never released it. But we ended up writing our first game design document together, my friend Micah and I, and designed this whole experience that very weirdly became a video game someone else made this year, but was very similar in its concept. But we wrote this whole story, this whole narrative, this whole gameplay experience, and we sent it to Sony and said, "Hey, look, we know Nintendo's your biggest rival. Why don't you make a Pokemon killer game?" And they replied, "No, thank you. We don't want to be sued, and you're 12." But they replied and they said, "You should keep pursuing game development." And I remember thinking, "Whoa, okay, cool." So at that point, I started doing mods for games, which is when you take an existing game and you do something different with it and you put it up online. And I built these maps for a game called Warcraft 2, and they were very story driven. And so you can imagine, this is before voice chat or anything like that. Everybody would get in to play my map, and I would say, before I hit start, I have to explain to you the story of what is happening. And everybody's like, "We don't care, dude. Just let us play." So I had created this elaborate backstory of what was happening in my version of the Warcraft universe at the time. So I kept doing that for years, and then decided to go to college. I went to college for a computer science degree at Full Sail University. So I have a game design development computer science degree, and I quickly got into the industry doing game programming. And I started in that field for a while, and then started. Again, we're going to talk about story. I started sharing ideas and stories and humorous things with the creative director of the studio, and he said, "I think you should be a game designer. I don't think you should be a programmer." So I moved into game design, where I produced I don't know, 30 something games at Megatouch as a designer, another 15 or 20 as a programmer, and then left there to be a producer at id Software, working on games like Rage and Doom. And Doom is where I moved from just being a producer, which is someone who like a producer in film is just making sure stuff gets done,
Right.
to being more involved in a creative front, helping design weapons and really helping with the narrative team. I was helping organize the narrative team, and then quickly started getting a little more involved, doing some research on how Mars works, and how the physics of Mars, where our game takes place, is. And then at some point you go to hell. And so then I started doing research on what hell is like in different religions around the world, and bringing different ideas to the table as opposed to the very stereotypical Judeo-Christian view of hell. And we got to integrate some of that stuff into the game. So that was really fun. And then I left there to go to Epic to work on Fortnite, which was a crazy, weird game. It didn't make any sense when I got there, and that's why I wanted to work on it, because it was just so bizarre and different. And we didn't know that it would become, a cultural phenomenon. I think we all knew it was big. It was going to be something significant, but I don't think any of us knew it was going to be something as significant. Fast forward 3-4 years later, and I was on the back of my friend's motorcycle in India, and this kid pulls up to me, and I'm wearing a Fortnite shirt, and he's wearing a Fortnite shirt in like some small rural part of India. And I'm like, "Hey," and he's like, "Hey, Fortnite's cool." And I'm like, "Hey, that's kind of cool." Right? So little did we know. And then I left Epic to start my own business. I started out by writing a few books on game production and how to make games. Really, I call them handbooks, because as opposed to having a narrative arc or a whole arc where you're starting at 0 and going to 100, it is, I have a problem, I open the book to a certain point, and find a tool to address that problem. So I've written 4 versions of that for different groups with a co-author, and those have been mildly successful. And from there, I started my own consultancy and coaching business. And throughout all of my consulting and coaching, I've also been making games. So I've shipped another 4 or 5 games in the last 5 years, and have a couple more that I'm working on now. So that's my background, and I hope now you understand me a little better.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I thank you. I'm in awe of that story. The India is a nice, like, chef's kiss anecdote. But what strikes me is in the literary world, we're fond of, and I don't know who to credit for first saying it, but basically, like, write the book you want to see in the world. And it's like, that is the primary motivation. I mean, writers start by imitation, but it also begins even before that. Writers are usually readers. gamers or, game designers or game players. There's a passion there. There's a familiarity there. There's the proverbial 10,000 hours of,
Yeah.
of getting into how these worlds are created. But what strikes me the most about everything you just said, because we can say story a million times. Then what you talked about was getting even deeper into what makes stories work, which is
Mm.
connecting with an audience on some level, which requires authenticity. And I'm deeply impressed by, and I'm humbled because I had never really thought about the real work that goes in. Like, well, how do you get authenticity in a game? Well, you use a computer and it does all this stuff. It's like, to get from step one to step a million, there are so many layers. But I really appreciate the real deep research that goes into parts of the game, and I just think it helps underscore the work that goes into any creative process. Because I think when we see the end result, it's kind of like seeing a concert pianist or an athlete at a high level. It's like, well, they're just gifted, and it's like, well, there's gifts involved, but this is the result of a lot of work that you didn't see happening that makes this look so easy. I think a game that succeeds, it's easy maybe for the layperson to assume, well, they're just really good at that, or they just got lucky and did something that worked. It's like there's so much trial and error, right?
Yeah. I'm definitely on some watch list for the deep research I've done. If you played Doom, the 2016 version, it's very graphic. And so I had to, with my team, I think all of us were doing research on how body parts dismember and things like that. So I'm definitely on some watch lists. But I have friends who are actors in Hollywood, and we kind of compare ourselves in that they have to learn new things to be on film. And when we're making games, we tend to deep research things that I would never care about, right? Like I've read like 25 books on Mars, right? I've talked to people who've worked at NASA on Mars rovers to try and understand that. I have a deep understanding of hell in multiple religions and what damnation looks like. I have a deep understanding of how to dismember bodies. But it's, to me, that's what really drew me to games. Is I'm just an intensely curious person, and it's an excuse to deep dive into things and get paid for it. And it's worked out so far.
Well, and you know what? I think that when I'm talking about, right, peeling the layers, we talked about, writers are usually readers. The fundamental connecting tissue, I think, as humans in this impulse for storytelling is curiosity. Without the curiosity, I don't think you can get to the authenticity, because we just know on some intuitive level, whether it's a game or a book or a movie or whatever, if the person's feeling it. And what you were just describing reminds me, earlier in this season, we talked to Lou Byard, the historical novelist, and I had asked him about the research that he does. And for him, it's like the book is the delivery device to go deep into a topic. So there's such a lesson there for creative endeavors, but I think for any endeavor, like, whatever the end result is, if the success is in monetary or clicks, that's one way to measure it. But I think when we talk about long careers, especially in industries that are really competitive, if the individual is not fully invested and enjoying it on some level, it always begs that question, like, what are you doing it for? Because
Right.
even if you do succeed, however we define success or ways to define it, if you're not filling some part of an itch that you want to scratch, you're just you're following really like the wrong path.
Right. Yeah. And I can tell you, I've had successes and I've had failures, and I've learned and had as much fun working on both. Right. Like I get to deep dive on things, spend time on them, learn new skills, learn new things that I want to do. Lately more of my work has been philosophical, right? So I've made over 70 games at this point. I don't need to make another shooter that says nothing. I want to make stuff that says something. And so, I spent years working on a game that was a total flop, but to me it said something, right? And that was what I needed. I needed to get out in the world, and I was fine with that. I learned a lot. I had fun working on it, had a good time with the team, and none of us we all had money at the end, so it was okay.
Right. Right. Well, and Grant, there's not a Glenn. Sorry, I have Grants written down here.
Grant
Glenn,
is my name. Grant is my name.
what did I
Grant
just say?
Shonkwiler.
Yeah.
You're good.
I've got Glenn and Grant. Anyway, so I have talked to very few, if any, successful writers that don't have at least the first novel or the first story collection that never got out of their drawer. But usually, when they talk about it, it's not just nostalgia; it's what you learn along the way. It's what you learn from that process, and how in some cases, right, the failures are as important, the rejections are as important, because it's also teaching you what doesn't work or what doesn't connect.
Yeah.
And again, the reason I always point that out, and I tend to circle back to that in these conversations, because I think in our contemporary society, I think social media has not helped this. We do tend to measure success, and I have to do by kind of different criteria than we used to, which is
Mm.
if the end result nets money, or the end result nets, insert criteria. But this notion of learning your craft deeply, I think we undersell how much failure and trial and error goes into it. Talk a little bit about some of the things you did learn from the things that didn't work, and how that made you kind of
Yeah.
to explore different things.
Yeah. So, and I, this is a bit ridiculous because I feel like I'm tooting my own horn here, but I won an award, and they said you can get up and you can talk about your, what your journey to winning this award. And so I did an 8-minute speech on every major failure in my career, because I think it's important that we understand that failure leads to success, right? Failure isn't fatal, nor is it final, right? To quote, I believe that's Churchill. But it's something that is kind of a consistent bump throughout my career, is that I've had some moment of intense failure that's led to success or to something new, right? And so for me, the failures have been many throughout my career, but what I always have learned from them is that you have to learn from them, right? And so, for example, I had a situation where I got really burnt out. I was working on Fortnite, got really burnt out. I quit my job. I went and lived on an island in the South Pacific for a little while. I did some farming. I did some construction work. I was just trying to figure out what I wanted to do, right? And from that, I kind of formulated that the reasons I was getting burnt out was because of the way leadership was structured in a lot of game companies that I had worked at, and the way that they had put pressure on individuals. And so out of that, I decided to start learning how to be a leadership coach, and then starting a leadership coaching business and a production consulting business, because I wanted to save other creatives like me from the pain that I had experienced of intense burnout after years and years of shipping games. So that's a pretty easy one for me to point out. But from a creative standpoint, the thing that I've learned the most, the thing that I preach the most to other game designers, is two things. It is one, figure out what you want to say and simplify down to that thing, and then you can build around it. I've built games that are too complex, and so what we're trying to accomplish, the core fun or the core philosophy, gets muddied, and players don't react well to that, right? They understand stuff that isn't genuine. They understand stuff that is just tacked on. It needs to all be part of the theme. And then the second thing is, I always tell people, what are we trying to say? How are we
Yeah.
trying to say it? Who are we trying to say it to? And when are we going to say it, right? And those are the things that we figure out, and we put all of our efforts toward it. And from that, you have all these other devices of building pillars and vision statements and things like that, to drive a team forward. But you have to consistently say, this is who we're trying to talk to, and this is what we're trying to say to them. And I find that teams that have that early, the work that they make is so genuine, that it feels different. Now, you can play a highly polished game that's made by thousands of people, and it feels good, but there's something that always just feels slightly off, right? And there's games I've played that are like beautiful, near perfect gameplay, but it just feels corporate, I guess is the way to say it. Like there's no heart to it. And then I've
Yeah.
played games that feel a little rough around the edges, but the heart of what is coming through is so pronounced, that as an individual, not just a game player or a game maker, I latch onto that, and really champion it and tell everybody they got to play it and stuff like that.
So thank you for that. I definitely want to get a little bit more into leadership because you've got such an interesting and authentic purview there. But one of the things when we talked before, in one of our earlier conversations, what struck me was, no one that's ever watched a movie hasn't noticed at the end, like the cast of, like, we tend to associate with the director, but when the cast
Right.
of credits that can take minutes to scroll down,
Yeah.
you start to appreciate there are a lot of people executing this vision. There are a lot of different roles that were played, and there's always there has to be a leader or a coach, but it really helps appreciate the magnitude of the achievement. It complicates, I think, and helps people understand that must have taken a lot of work and a lot of coordination. I think similarly, and I'm just speaking for myself, but I imagine I'm not alone. We see the company name, like, yeah, that company produces video game, and how often do we actually stop and think, what does that involve? And so just hearing you talk gives me a much deeper appreciation of the different levels of narrative, the visual, the technical. Talk a little bit more about what is required and how it maybe is either different or similar to a movie where there is a director of sorts, but it is about this notion of getting people in unison because that's going to deliver a better project. That's not ego so much as vision.
Yeah, I think probably the two biggest differences of film and games is in games you are employed for the whole cycle, right? In film, you might be on set, you might be doing post production, you might be doing VFX, you might be doing something like that, but you're not there for the whole thing. And the other thing is, because of that, the vision, the creativeness is collaborative, right? I have a lot of friends that work on film. I've done a little work on film, and there you're just told, this is what we're making by a writer or director. Go do these things. This is your shot list. Go create these things, right? And you can be creative in that space, right? But it is very rigid in that this is what we're going to make. Games is very collaborative, right? The way that we are successful is by having a solid, consistent vision that is communicated throughout the team and people understand what we're making. And then they can interpret that in their craft. So when we were working on Doom, we came up with a vision statement and some pillars. The pillars being, these are the things that our whole game is built on. So for example, in Doom, it's movement is offensive and defensive. We don't have reloading because of that. That's kind of the different examples. And we came up with this statement and we just kept saying it in front of the team until one day I was walking through a group of designers, and one of them like said it genuinely to another person, not like blah 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 blah. They said it genuinely, and the person was like, "You're right. That isn't what we're making. We're making this game, so that has to fit into it." So the first thing you really have to do is you have to figure out, what is our vision of where we're working. Some teams do that by starting to find what the fun core loop is. What is the mechanic that you're doing? Miyamoto, who makes games at Nintendo, that's where he really focuses on what is that core loop. Some will start with the vision of, like I said, what are we trying to say? Who are we trying to talk to? What is our vehicle for that? So you may say, hey, we want to have a conversation about post-capitalist society in a solar punk universe, right? And the people we want to communicate to are the climate champions or something like that of today. Okay, that then changes what you're going to make your game vehicle be. So there's a couple different ways to start that, but then once you have that figured out, you have to constantly communicate that to the team as you're developing different things. So we go through a fairly, I guess you would call it, traditional cycle, similar to film, similar to even writing in my experience, where you have pre-production, which is kind of like you figure out your outline, your players, your characters, things like that, your art style, your settings, things like that. And that may be a little bit smaller team, and then you grow it up to a bigger team as you move into production. Production is you're building the game as a whole, you're building all the assets, you're making the bugs work, not be a problem, and you're putting the whole package together. And then you go into post-production, which is really live service now, which is we support the game after it comes out. We put out technical updates, just like any app on your phone or any software that you use. There are updates to make sure that it's functional, but there also might be updates that players can pay for and get more involved in. So it's kind of the hardest challenge is keeping that consistent theme throughout that. And it goes one step above that. Not only do you have to have the theme and the vision in that team, you now have to have that in your marketing team and the way that you're communicating out to everybody else. We've all seen movies that we've seen the trailer and thought, wow, that looks really cool. And then we get in and we see a completely different movie. I think my favorite example is the bait and switch of Drive, the movie Drive, because everybody went in thinking they were going to watch Fast and Furious. And then it was Nicholas Winding Refn is taking you through this slow burn journey of just extreme violence and what someone does for someone that they care about. And you're like, I remember going to see that in the theater, and multiple people walked out, and I heard them, "This wasn't Fast and the Furious," and I'm like, they got him, right? With games, that doesn't work because people can refund really easily. So you have to have that thematic, that vision, that understanding of what people are going to play, so that when they buy it, they already know what it is they're getting into. We've seen examples where people don't do that, and people come in to play the game, and then it's completely different, and people refund the game. So it's a very complex business, because your teams can range from, well, one person to 12 people to 2,000 people across the globe, and so it's important that we keep those through lines of, this is what we're making, this is who we're making it for, through everybody.
Yeah, I mean, very well said. And it occurs to me that in some ways writers have had it easier traditionally, because you wrote a book, and at a certain point it was vetted and validated, but then the writer just was a writer. And of course, one of the other things I talk about a lot and talk to a lot of people is, it's because there's so much content out there now, it's increasingly necessary for the author to work on their brand and be at least familiar with marketing and sales, and this notion of, you could write the best book in the world and it might just fall in like a tree in the forest if no one is aware of it. So it begs the question, what's your social media look like? What is your engagement? Do you have a newsletter? Do you have a blog? How are you engaging with your audience beforehand? And I still talk to a lot of writers that are resisting that, and for understandable reasons, because many writers are not extroverts or creatives, because they lack or are not interested in those other skills. So it's a real conundrum right now. I think it's a real cultural crisis in a late stage capitalist kind of American model. How does the artist thrive? And I think a lot of artists could benefit from your example in particular, but just more broadly, how have movies and musicians and gaming had to do a lot of these roles all along? I think writers can actually learn more from that than other writers.
Yeah. We usually have a community management team, but we start building community pretty early, even when there's one or two people working on the game. Once we understand what we're making, if the publisher allows us, we start building a community around us, around the people making the game and the vision of the game early, and we get people in and playing it, and they become our champions, right? They go out and tell their friends to play the game. I often think about The Martian and how that book was written. So for people who don't know, he was a game developer. He worked at Blizzard, and he started writing the book, and he started putting it up online and getting feedback from real scientists. He started getting feedback on the story from people. So he wrote his book in the style of making an early access video game. And so when it was finally published, it wasn't perfect, right? But it had gone through so many revisions of both readers saying, this part's boring, this part's interesting, but also technical analysis, because it's a very technical book, of real people who worked at NASA, because they somehow got into his community. And so, I think there's really interesting ways to kind of navigate this in a different, style than just, here's my book, someone bless it and hope that it's on, Oprah's favorite things or whatever by the end of the year, right? I don't know how many books are published a year, but we have 300 to 400 video games published every day. So to stand out in that crowd is, very, very hard.
So what are some disadvantages for, say, a younger or amateur gamer to break in this industry? I know, and the reason I'm asking that specifically is, I'll always remember, and I've written about this. I was at a conference, and I did a panel with some literary agents, and coincidentally or not, it was an older agent that had had a lot of success in the 20th century, and some younger writer in the audience, raised their hand and said, what advice do you have about some of these concerns? And the agent said, you write a good book, that's all that matters, and the rest will fall away. And it was
Yeah.
it was at once this arrogant, really out of touch and misguided, but there's an element of, you do have to put quality and
Yeah.
work out there and hope for the best. But I'm curious, like, what advice do you give in your kind of evolving role as a community builder and leader
Mm.
to younger, especially say ones with the talent? What else do they need to know, or what obstacles are they going to have to overcome?
Well, the game industry is very small. When I started in the game industry, almost 20 years ago, there were fewer professional game developers in the world than there were professional soccer players, right? So, because the community is small, having some sort of strong network is really important. And so, the first thing I tell people is find yourself a mentor. That is the first thing to do. And most people in the game industry are really open to helping others. As you mentioned, writers are introverts. Game developers are also introverts. Most of us are on the spectrum, and so the way that we connect is through our shared love of games. And so, what I tell younger people is the first thing you have to do is be excellent at your craft. The second thing you have to do is to find a mentor or someone who will start to open up doors for you. And it's not that they're going to get you a job, right? They're going to introduce you to someone, just like someone introduced me to you, right? Like that would never have happened if it wasn't for these connections that we've made as we've been doing what we've done for 20 plus years. But early on, you get someone, who can help you with that. I was very lucky early in my career that the guy who made me want to make video games became my mentor. Total fluke, not a fluke, but a bit of a fluke. I saw that he was going to be speaking at a conference that I was volunteering at, and I went and I sat in the room until he came in, and I'm sitting there nervously. I was 18 years old, and he sat down right next to me. And I remember having this moment of like, okay, I can say something or I can say nothing, and he will never know who I am. Right. And I could embarrass myself. And I said to him, his name's Warren Spector. I said, Mr. Spector, my name's Grant Shonkwiler. I've wanted to make games for years. I've been making games for years. It all started because I played your game, Deus Ex, and it opened my eyes to understand what games could be. I would love if I could just ask you a couple questions. And he's like, yeah, of course. And keep in mind, he's 30 years into his career at this point. And I talked to him for a few minutes, and then he said, "Hey, I don't normally do this, but here's my cell phone number. I want you to send me a text message or call me after this event, and I want to make sure that we connect and we get each other's emails, and I'd like to help you as you journey into the industry." And now I used that very sparingly early in my career. I just kind of would be like, "Hey, here's my resume. Do you have any feedback on it?" He'd look at it for 5 minutes, give me some feedback. But as I progressed in the industry, and I started to lead teams, I started to talk to him more about stuff and say, "Hey, Warren, I'm dealing with this problem. How have you dealt with it before?" And it came full circle. He ended up becoming a professor, and he asked me to give him feedback on what he was teaching and give him feedback on it. And he said his words were, "Because I respect who you are in the industry." And so I say that story not to be like, "Whoa, look at me." I say that story to say, these people that you look up to and you think are impossible to connect with are just people, right? A friend of mine once said, the moment that opened his eyes was when he went to the bathroom and the programmer that he had idolized since he was 8 years old was at the urinal next to him, and he said, "We all have to pee." Right. And so he said, I could talk to him. So he waited till he came out of the bathroom, and he went and talked to him. Right. So those are the two things that I say. You have to be excellent in your craft, and then you have to find people to connect with. The other thing is you can find people around you to connect with that are at the same level as you, and they'll journey through their whole career. Most of my close friends, people who were in my wedding, were people I went to college with who wanted to make games as passionately and as deeply as I did. And then the last thing, just like you probably would tell people, you got to do the work, right? You got to make games. And so games are not usually a solitary effort. So there's multiple ways to do that. You can join teams online, or you can make parts of games, but you have to start doing your craft in the context of a game. So you can't just be programming code. You have to be making a game. And so I think the path in is different than it was when I came in, but I think that the fundamentals are the same. You can network online now. That's way easier. We didn't have LinkedIn or anything like that. You can post your stuff online easier. You can find teams easier. If you want to personally build a brand, you can also do that using YouTube, TikTok, whatever it is. So I think there's a lot of different ways into it, but the fundamentals are the same. You have to want to make games. You have to be good at your craft. You have to find people who are passionate, who will care about you, and then you got to make games.
Yeah, you got to do it. That was such a great, like, in you. I was specifically going to ask you about community. I think we can get a little more. I think, but you just mic dropped the whole importance of it one's being part of something and giving back to something. I think when you were talking about your genuine and very refreshing reticence to meet your hero, the reality, right, is that most creatives are doing this because they're in search of connection and starting dialogue. So a respectful introduction, I think most of us, and I'll just speak for writers, or I won't even speak for writers, but most writers I know, nothing would make them happier than having someone tell them, whether it's an email or in person, at a reading event, your work was meaningful to me. It's like, that's
Yeah.
what you do this for. So I think that's good to break down some of those barriers about that. But maybe talk a little bit more about how you've seen it from both ways. You just beautifully articulated why it is critical to seek out mentors, but from the other side, and you did speak about it, but in terms of the importance of being part of a community, even once you've gotten to a certain level, once the proverbial door is closed behind you, why it's important to keep that door open, and not only why that's good in terms of paying it forward, but also I would imagine, especially in gaming, being around enthusiastic novices helps you keep your skills fresh and understand what the coming generations are excited by and interested in.
Yeah, yeah. It's always been important to me to give back to new people coming up because of how generous with their time other people were to me. So I mentioned Warren, but there's a dozen more that have been with me my entire career, be it in a mentoring capacity or in a, hey, I'm 2 years ahead of you. Here's what I've accomplished. Here's what I'm doing, which drives me passionately, into this stuff. And so I've spoken at universities, high schools, middle schools, things like that. I find that really important. I always try to keep 5 to 6 mentors myself at different capacities. Some of them are, they're birds flying on their own and they contact me once a year. Some of them I talk to on a monthly basis. I've had the opportunity to hire a few and have them work directly for me, which has been incredible to help them accelerate their career in that way. I go back to Full Sail University where I went pretty regularly, and I say when I go there, it's as much for me as it is for me to help people, and that's because the passion of a novice, of a new person,
Right.
is what fuels me, and I'm a vampire, and so I have to go and collect their energy from them and their passion to remind me what I was like when I was, like would do anything to get into this industry, and I did crazy things like work 90-hour weeks for 6 months and stuff like that, and now I don't want to do that, but I still need that passion and that drive
Right.
to both remind me of how cool it is that I'm here, but also to fuel further creative efforts. So a lot of that, I've worked with the International Game Developers Association in different capacities for years as a volunteer, running local chapters, and those are geared towards everyone who wants to make games. But in general, there tend to be a lot of new people in universities and stuff like that attend those. And I've worked with some other organizations as well to try and bring people into the industry that maybe would not see it as a place where they could have a career, and that's one of the main things is I want people to understand that this is a career. The average career expectancies, life expectancy in the game industry is 5 years. Still, it's been that for 20 years, and so part of why I started my business is to make game development more sustainable so that people can come in and work for 25, 30, 40, 50 years. There's not a lot of us that are 20 plus years at this point, be it they retire, or they just say, I'm done with this, man. Like, this is just, it's a soul suck. I can go work in financial technology and make 3 times the amount. But that's never been an interest to me. So I find it vital to build back, give back, be part of those communities. And then the other communities that I'm part of are people who are a little farther along their journey, more senior like me, that push each other, and we challenge each other. We run our own businesses. We are leaders at major companies, and there's a small group of us that meet once a year in a cool location. We always say we try and meet in the most Bond villain locations we can find, and we talk about our problems. We talk deeply about what we're dealing with, be it on a personal level or at a company level, and we workshop those as a group of 20 to 25 people. And that, to me, has really sustained me ever since I've been in the leadership part of the game industry, because people don't like bosses. So it's good to have other people who are in those positions tell you you're doing what you can to help people.
Right. Again, thank you for all of that. There's so many rabbit holes I'm like longing to go down, but I did want to, because you said it twice now, and I think I'm curious to know more about the burnout rate and how endemic to the gaming industry that is, or is it as much a function of contemporary hustle and a leadership issue? Because you've already kind of given the answer. I want to dive deeper into the question, maybe, or the concern. You're exemplifying, like, you've pushed yourself to be a leader and be a better leader and a giving leader, and ideally, right, in all sectors, that's going to reap benefits for society. But speaking specifically about gaming, what have you noticed, both in you mentioned your own burnout and the bad leaders you've had? I'm assuming that there's obvious commonalities between any profession, but what is it about gaming in particular that you could enlighten us on?
Yeah, so the first thing is the passion, right? And so it's really easy for you to overwork yourself being passionate, but it's also very common, and this is not a good thing, for managerial people to take advantage of people's passion and drive them and say, we're making something great. We have to sacrifice for greatness, right? And I don't know how much you know about Leonardo da Vinci, but like, he's probably one of the most consequential humans of all time, and that dude was super lazy, right? Like, he was supposed to make this statue of a horse for some monks, and he took their money for 10 years while he described the arc of the wing of a bird. What does that have to do with a horse? Nothing, right? But he created some of the greatest works of art, and he moved engineering forward 100 years, right? So I argue that passion equals overworking. I don't think that's true, and so that's one of the fights that I'm constantly up against. The other big thing in our industry is, I mentioned there's a lot of neurodiversity, people who are on the spectrum or whatever. They get moved into leadership positions. They have no training. They have no understanding of what leadership could be. This is everybody, sorry, not just the people who are neurodivergent or on the spectrum, but everyone gets moved from, you are a creative professional. So imagine you're an author, right? And now all of a sudden, you've been in your cave writing, doing your research, having a great time, and now all of a sudden you have 10 other writers you're responsible for, and no one tells you how to do that. That's what 99% of game companies do. They just say, hey, here you go. And then your employees are passionate or they're neurodiverse, and they are easily taken advantage of, right? And so in my own experience, I saw someone who was a sociopath, and he took advantage of people in ways that were very gaslighting, very aggressive, very mean, and things like that. And when I raised these concerns to the people that I was working with and upwards, their response, because they also don't have this training, is, oh, well, he gets good results. And I'm like, yeah, but people are quitting, right? So that's why, for me, it's something I'm so passionate about. The other thing that is important to understand is that a lot of people get paid pretty well in the game industry. It pays universally well, but if you are a senior programmer in the game industry, you're making $200,000 a year. That's pretty good. But you could go work at a financial tech company and get 450,000 a year. So
Right.
that's why we see a lot of that kind of movement out. That's not the same as burnout, but that's why we lose a lot of our more senior talent is they get to a point where they say, I don't want to work late nights. I'm not as passionate about this anymore. I have 3 kids and a mortgage. I can work 40 hours a week and get paid triple what I'm getting paid now. And some of my closest friends have done that, and they're quite happy. They make games for fun on the side. But those are kind of the 3 core major things that I see. I think we're working towards solving those in a lot of different ways. Some of that is there's a big unionization talk around a mandatory, like you can't work more than this many hours. There's conversations about what I do, which is more leadership coaching and developing our leaders. And then the last one is pay, right? And making sure that this is, again, a sustainable career and the career that people want to choose to be in. And the reason they're choosing it is not just because they're passionate about games, but also because they can make a good living here.
So I'm curious, are you optimistic about the way the industry in particular and society in general is adapting and embracing? Is it still very much a work in progress? I'm getting optimism from you, which tracks because you're doing it. So you can speak from your own experience, which I want to like acknowledge and celebrate. Like we need a lot more leaders, like yourself. But yeah, how are you feeling about kind of the moment we're in, I guess, culturally?
Yeah, I mean, the moment sucks for the game industry. We've had 35,000 layoffs in the last 2 years, 26 months, and it's not slowing. And some of that is related to what's happening in the economy, VC money, and things like that. Some of that is big bets went poorly. There's a lot of nuance there. I'm not the person to talk about that, but
Right.
I am also hopeful in that as we see collapses of bigger companies, the reemergence of smaller companies where people say, I want to work in a way that is good. I want to take care of my employees. I want to make games with meaning and purpose and things like that. Those are going to increase, right? And so the industry goes through boom and bust cycles, just like any industry. We had a huge bust in the '80s. We had a huge bust in the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And this is our third turning, I guess you would say. This is our next big bust. But I am hopeful that something that makes me very hopeful is Gen Z. Gen Z makes me really hopeful because they are comfortable talking about things that millennials like myself and Gen X are not comfortable talking about, and they bring some of this stuff to the forefront. Now, there's some stuff they need to work through, immaturity. They can't come in and become a lead within 2 days or whatever, which I've dealt with before. But their ability to say something isn't right,
Yeah.
something needs to change, or like I have this neurodiversity, or I am emotionally blah blah blah. Their willingness to talk about some of these things that were very taboo when I was coming up make me hopeful for the future of society. But I have to be hopeful, right? Like if I'm not hopeful, I wouldn't have 2 young kids, right? I have a 3-month-old downstairs. I wouldn't have agreed to have a second kid with my wife if I wasn't hopeful.
Right, right. Well, that leads us wonderfully, and I don't know how deep you want or need or able to get into this, but again, having the benefit of having other conversations with you, I think all of this is just naturally leading up to how you're continuing to deploy all these different skills and interests into what you're working on now, whether we get specific or not, because there's elements of not only leadership and startup type pressures, but fundraising, nonprofit type work, research, et cetera. If you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now and why that I'm sure is also fueling some enthusiasm and optimism.
Yeah, so I've started working on a game that is really the culmination of my entire career, having worked with nonprofits and worked in games and things like that. So for the last 5 years, I've worked for a think tank based out of DC called the Atlantic Council, and their division called the Adrian Arsh Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, doing research on how we build resiliency to climate disasters in individuals through gaming. That was a lot. So basically, to summarize, I've been doing research with a team for the last 5 years to understand how we make games in a way that teach people skills to prepare for disasters. And so where we've arrived after this 5 years is at a game that we call the Climate Crisis Academy, and we're building it with a team based out of South Africa in Cape Town. And it's a game unlike anything I've ever made, in that it's not graphically heavy or hard. It is a game that is played through WhatsApp. WhatsApp is the most used communication platform on Earth. The only country that it's not number one is the United States and China. So those are the only two countries where it's not the number one way that people communicate with each other. And so we looked at that and we said, what can we do within this system? And it turns out you can do a lot. You can have inventories and tell stories and send images and videos and GIFs and all these different things. And so the idea of the game is that we are hyper localized. And so an individual city, even a community within that city, can build their own game to build a community around climate resilience. So just for an example, the game that we're starting with is based in Cape Town, which is where our development team is based. And it tells the story of a young woman going to Table Mountain on a camping trip, and there's a large forest fire there. It's something that happens all the time. I believe they said it's an annual thing. The mountain catches on fire, and she's unprepared. She doesn't know how to deal with that situation. So through the gameplay experience, which is just done through chatting and picking options and emojis and things like that, you're having a conversation as the story unfolds that's teaching you the skills to how to prepare for a forest fire. So with this, we're building a framework that any storyteller in the world can come on board and tell a story in their community using their local legends, their language, their parlance, their disasters that they're used to prepare their community. So it might be as big as a whole country, but it could be as small as a small neighborhood, or a village or a town of people. And so we're trying to build out this framework in a way that, it pays for itself, but also we can go to individuals and pay them to write these stories and build this with us. So we're early days. We're still fundraising. It's a little hard to fundraise right now because we're asking for donations. We're not asking for people to get money out of this. They're not going to make money off of it. That's not our goal. Our goal is to reach 1 billion people with climate resilience messaging. I want to prepare the world for the disasters that are happening today. This is not a controversial political topic. Helene just happened down the street from me, basically, and people weren't prepared for it, right? And my in-laws live on the coast, and they are hurricane experts, right? They have all these kits and all these prepared things, and then you come inland 40 miles, and nobody has anything ready for these situations, right? So I want to prepare people. So that's really the culmination of everything I've done for the last 20 years of my career into a single idea, and it's been really. Man, it's been just such a breath of fresh air to work on something like this that has purpose, it has meaning, and uses all these skills that we've spent years learning. So yeah, now we're just getting money. So that's the hard part, and then we'll make the game.
Right. Well, so that's remarkable on so many levels, and is so laudable and exciting and inspiring. But I also love that you again, you're just teeing up things that are in my sweet spot, because one of the things I'm constantly talking to creatives about is what I would call, for lack of a better cliche, kind of this phobia of tech. And how tech is ruining everything. And it's like any bad argument. Of course, you can make huge generalizations and you can find easy cherry-picked things to support that argument. But what you're talking about there, among many things, is this notion of being very in the moment, which is, how do we use technologies that are not going away, by the way? Like, we can't wish them away. How do we employ technology to actually get more authenticity, to give more opportunities for voices to be heard, and to connect with people? And so there are ways that technology, WhatsApp, for instance, smartphone, is making the opportunity for people from diverse cultures to connect freely and openly and learn more. I think those are the stories that in the creative circles, the academic circles, we're not hearing enough. I think there's so much fear and fear mongering about AI and how tech is making people not want to read, or tech is dumbing down the brains. And it's like, we can and should address those on individual levels, case by case. But broadly speaking, I think it does us a huge disservice to spread phobia about technology writ large. So you just did kind of deconstruct that, but maybe talk a little bit more about your perspective on how we have to lean into technology and the ways in which we can acknowledge the threats or the dangers, but really turn those into positives with education.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is something I've battled with my whole career. When I was making a game once and published it, I was at a GameStop and a mom came in, saw my shirt, saw what company I worked for, and told me I was a baby killer. I have no idea where that came from. I don't know what the association with my game company was with killing babies, but
Is it
like, I don't know. I don't know what it was. So, it's always been something that has been part of the game industry. We've been threatened as an industry, my entire career, and even before that, by different people trying to censor us and take us down. But with games, games are the oldest way that humans learn, right? They're the oldest way that creatures learn. Even before written language and before cave drawings, people used games to learn how to hunt. People use games to teach how to start fires, right? It's been part of our DNA forever, right? And so the way we make games and the way we communicate has just changed with technology. And so I think it's important that we, like you said, we understand some of the threats to it, right? We shouldn't be letting 12 and 13-year-olds use social media, right? Like that's a pretty well understood problem that we know how to solve. And hopefully technology companies come along with us. We need to understand how AI is going to change roles, but like, you're not going to replace the soul of a storyteller, right? You're not going to replace the touch of a human creative. All AI does is it's a facsimile of data that it has taken in and it regurgitates. There's nothing creative there, right? If you go and you look at how ChatGPT has evolved, right? It still consistently fails on creative challenges. It can solve it can go in and answer your law exam perfectly. It can go in and do your math test perfectly because all that is regurgitating information. But as soon as you ask it to creatively solve a problem, it falls flat on its face, right? And just like we have very particular articulated hands and can do very specific things. My neighbor is an engineer who works on robotics that are in factories. He's like, there are certain things that technology is 30 to 40 years away, that they can pick up these minuscule objects and manipulate them in the way that we can with our hands. Same thing with our brains, right? So I think it's important that we understand the limitations of it, because I think that makes me feel less threatened by it. And then I start to say, what do I have to do to use this to do what I want to do, right? And so WhatsApp, as an example, is used to communicate. It's used for banking. It's how brands in other countries communicate with people. It's how people get customer service. It's pretty much everything, right? In the U.S., we don't really use it that way. That's fine. We probably will never use it that way. That's okay. But I looked at this along with my team and we said, okay, how can we use the technology that they're building in to automate the way brands talk with people and turn that into a game engine? And so that's been the real challenge there, to learn the technology, embrace the technology, and meet people where they are. And that's what I think is important about as technology changes, is that we're seeing how people are using it, and then we meet them where they are, right? I remember the conversations, 15, 16 years ago, where I heard this conversation on NPR where someone was like, is the written word going to be replaced by emojis? And this expert said, but the written word came from emojis. Go to Egypt, right? Like that's how they were communicating for 1,000, 3,000 years. They were not using script. They were using images. And so it's not going to replace it. It just changes it slightly. And we talked about this last time, but anytime anybody is scared of technology, I just remind them, go online and look up old newspapers of when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, and how people thought it was going to be the collapse of all society forever, right?
Yeah.
And what happened is it freed people to go and do other types of jobs. I'm not sure AI is going to be 100% there. I do think it is going to replace some jobs in the future, 10, 15, 20 years from now. But I think that, in some ways, maybe that allows those of us who are in the creative field to have more freedom to spend time doing creative things.
That's right. That's right. So, as always, whenever I have a great conversation like this, there's this bittersweet moment where I recognize, like, I couldn't be happier, but I didn't even get to ask some of the questions. So but I can't think of a better note to end on of that optimism and bringing things full circle. But I think it also means we've got to talk again because we didn't get into your favorite books, some of the more selfish personal questions I wanted to ask. But you completely exceeded my expectations because I wanted to debunk and kind of really demystify some of the more technical creativity that we see around us. But you ended up giving like a baby TED talk on leadership, on the need and then the joy of creativity, community, just completely above and beyond. And it's very clear why you've been successful. So I want to thank you. And for people that are understandably excited and like, I want to learn from this guy, I will definitely do my homework and put it in the write up. But how can people connect with you and follow you in your books and the work you're doing?
Yeah, the best way is to go to shonkventures.com, which is SHONK ventures.com, or Google Grant Shonkwiler. My website will be the first thing to pop up. I have escaped from social media as I have young children. The only social media I have is LinkedIn, so you can connect with me there. That's fine too. But you can find me on my website. You can email me through my website, and I'm happy to chat with people about games and creativity and writing even.
Grant, amazing. So grateful to have you here. Believe me, you dropped a lot of knowledge and dispensed a lot of wisdom. I'm grateful, but I'm positive that this is going to be really inspiring for anyone that is trying to understand our world better. So hopefully we'll talk again soon, but all the best. I definitely want to hear more about your work in progress. I think that's going to be, I can't help myself, a bit of a game changer. So to be continued for sure. Folks, thanks for checking out another episode of Some Things Considered. Remember, this is the podcast where we are obsessed with creativity and storytelling. We want to lift up voices, especially underrepresented voices. So if you know someone that should be on this podcast or want to recommend someone or yourself, let me know at SeanMurphy.net, and together we can lift up creativity by any means necessary. We'll see you soon. Be well and stay curious. Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Find out more, including how to be a guest, at SeanMurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. Also, we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. Drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. I'm Sean Murphy. See you on the next episode of Some Things Considered.